which the incredible, monumental additional debt which just recently has been piled upon us in artificially sustaining this inherently and inevitably terminal process. Imagine that. You see, we are already there. We are artificially sustaining ourselves at the terminal juncture, at the worst state of this system, which when these artificial processes soon fail, and they will, because they have their limitations as well, when they fail, we are going down the tube like like a rubber band was strained by this artificial suspension, which Bernanke is proud. He's extended the lifespan of this, this obfuscation of the currency a while longer. But in so doing, by piling all this further debt upon us, when these methods of artificial suspension fail, we will launch off into failure like like in potentially momentary manifestation of this house of cards all coming down with far greater debt than we can afford to service, and with that sum of debt so requiring us to pay immediately out of circulation the entire circulation that it can happen in practically the blink of an eye.
In the fall of 2008. It would have brought down the entire global financial system, and it would have had enormous implications, very long-lasting implications, for the global economy, not just the U.S. economy.
Which, of course, is what I've meant for over 40 years by the terms terminal failure. That is, once our creditworthiness is compromised that we can no longer afford to maintain a vital circulation ourselves, there is no actual means of recovering in abiding by the purported principles of the system. We cannot afford to borrow further, and that's all there is to it. It's over, you see. So we can't maintain a vital circulation. The circulation depletes, and it's a done deal.
But it's also true that the Fed was the regulatory watchdog of the largest banks when crazy lending led the world to crisis.
It's an utter lie that crazy lending led the world to crisis. The fact of the matter is that the obfuscation of the currency could only result in inevitably crazy lending, because at the terminal phases of this finite life cycle of this preposterous lie that we call economy, so much is dedicated to servicing debt that the creditworthiness of all of us is so compromised that the legitimacy of loaning to us is ever more so diminished until it gets so tenuous or doubtable or dubious that we can service any further debt, that of course all the debts are going to be quote-unquote bad. But what makes them quote-unquote bad is the obfuscation of the currency. It inherently multiplies all this debt into terminal sums of artificial debt, and at which state none of us are really qualified to assume further debt, particularly in general, which is what counts. Because if most of us are so compromised even, and we are, then the fact that few of us may be solvent is irrelevant, because being as we're all interdependent, which is why this is a global failure, but being as we're all dependent, we go down together.
Is there anything that you wish you'd done differently over these last 2.5 years or so?
Well, I wish I'd been omniscient and seen the crisis coming the way you asked me about.
But how could you ever be omniscient if you refuse to debate the purported rectitude of your obfuscation of the currency?
I didn't.
No, and you never will so long as you serve the bankers, which makes you the wrong man to serve the people.
But it was a very, very difficult situation. And the Federal Reserve responded very aggressively, very proactively.
How did the Fed miss the looming financial crisis?
There were large portions of the financial system that were not adequately covered by the regulatory oversight.
Yes, and he's going to point his finger every which way but at himself here and the Federal Reserve, which of course was the largest entity outside of the proper oversight. In other words, its processes have never been justified, not by Ben Bernanke or anyone before him or anyone after either. So, the idea of that regulation could have averted this problem is going to be part of his further lie here. Regulation can only temper an inherently terminal process.
So, for example, AIG was not overseen by the Fed.
The insurance company.
The insurance company that required the bailout was not overseen by the Fed. It didn't really have any real oversight at that time. Neither did Lehman Brothers, the company that failed. Now, I'm not saying the Fed, shouldn't have seen some of these things.
But how, just for instance, could regulation of an insurance company which is allowed to invest, quote-unquote invest, in securities which are only going to fail, and in debts, in buying bad debts which are only going to fail as a result of this obfuscation of the currency, how can regulation prevent any of this unless the regulation is to rectify the obfuscation of the currency?
One of the things that I most regret is that we weren't strong enough in putting in consumer protections to try to cut down on the subprime lending problem. That was an area where I think we could have done more.
How, in fact, can you really actually do more if the whole cause of the so-called subprime lending phenomena is this obfuscation of the currency, which inevitably compromises and destroys the creditworthiness of the entire purported economy, which is nothing more than a system of exploitation. So this is nothing here but pretension that the Fed was intending to foresee things or stop any of this deterioration. The Fed is the cause of the deterioration, period.
The gap between rich and poor in this country has never been greater. In fact, we have the biggest income disparity gap of any industrialized country in the world. And I wonder where you think that's taking America.
Well, it's a very bad development. It's creating two societies. And it's based very much, I think, on educational differences.
Another case yet of the pot calling the kettle black. We can't afford education because the Federal Reserve is destroying our ability to afford anything and everything. Moreover, the object of education is beyond, the dignity that we might achieve by, learning. The object of education is largely so that we can sustain ourselves in a modern society. And that object as well is defeated by this purposed obfuscation of the currency. So Bernanke can't blame this on education. He can't pretend rightly to sympathize with this because it's education that's gone awry. He's the cause of all of this going awry because we cannot afford to sustain anything under an obfuscation of the currency, which inherently and irreversibly multiplies artificial indebtedness in proportion to a circulation or remaining capacity to pay.
The unemployment rate we've been talking about, if you're a college graduate, unemployment is 5%. If you're a high school graduate, it's 10% or more. It's a very big difference. It leads to an unequal society and a society which doesn't have the cohesion that we'd like to see.
Education is an absolutely amazing scapegoat for the mouth of terminal exploitation.
We have talked about how the next several years are going to be tough years in this country. But I wonder what you think about the 10-year time horizon, 15 years. How do things look to you long term?
Long term, I have a lot of confidence in the United States. We have an excellent record in terms of innovation.
None of which innovation, of course, is provided by the purported central banking system, and all of which innovation is exploited to naught by the purported central banking system, by its obfuscation of the currency, which is inevitably and inherently terminal.
We have great universities that are involved in technological change and progress.
None of which technological progress will be rewarded under a system of terminal exploitation.
We have an entrepreneurial culture, much more than almost any other country.
None of which entrepreneurial culture can survive a system of terminal exploitation, except in the end, the purported entrepreneurial culture of the central banking system, which is the only surviving predator in the end.
So I think that in the longer term, the United States will retain its leading position in the world.
Plummeting from that position as fast as it is, and pitted against an imposed system of terminal exploitation, I just don't see how any thinking person could think that. In any legitimate way.
But again, we got to get there, and we have some very difficult challenges over the next few years.
So there you have it. The hollow assurances of Ben Bernanke that an inherently and inevitably terminal process will not be terminal under his reign. Next in line for a thorough undressing, then, is Dr. Ron Paul in his much raved about response to this Bernanke interview.
Congressman Ron Paul is talking to us about the Federal Reserve, the situation on the Korean Peninsula, and Sarah Palin. Congressman, good to see you as always. So,
Thank you.
This, I think, is one of your favorite subjects, the Federal Reserve, revealing trillions of dollars in emergency aid, something like $9 trillion overnight loans. Are you surprised by this?
You know, in a little way, I thought it was bad, but it's probably worse than I thought.
It was bad, but it's probably worse than I thought. You know, ending this thing, Mr. Paul can only crudely articulate is bad, is not about sloppy allusions, no more than inferring a person has the way out. And Mr. Paul's campaign, therefore, is no more than a most dangerous delusion of the most easily and simply pleased. If in fact Ron Paul has campaigned, however ignorantly or even inadvertently, to preserve the very thing which is terminal to all he pretends to protect in preserving interest. Liberty, which he often pretends to champion while advocating interest, and even while advocating a preservation of the present, ever unjustifiable, terminal obfuscation of our promissory obligations to each other. The object of liberty, which he pretends to claim on our behalf, is not a state in which the promissory obligations of individuals remain exploited not only by purported banks, but in fact would remain exploited by a terminal process which can only transfer all wealth for naught to a purported banking system, which Mr. Paul would preserve, claiming just that somehow, by some undeclared process, purported competition between the remaining banks which will persist in this terminal obfuscation of our promissory obligations to each other, and publishing a wee few of our promissory obligations to each other in gold,